A few years ago, Netflix gave Noah Baumbach $100 million to adapt Don DeLillo's White Noise. Having previously only worked in the mid-budget range on intimate, low-stakes dramas, such a high-budget jump, especially in service of adapting this existential piece of postmodern literature, had me both morbidly curious and genuinely excited to see what would come out of it. The movie was a total flop. Critically, I have my own mixed feelings about it, but commercially, it was a disaster. Now it seems Warner Brothers has taken a similar chance by throwing over $100 million at a different director who has previously only worked in the mid-budget range on a different adaptation of one of our great postmodernist authors, with Paul Thomas Anderson taking on Thomas Pynchon's Vineland. The difference is that, this time around, it seems to be a much more natural progression. With White Noise, there was perhaps too big a discrepancy between the low-key scope Baumbach was used to working in, stuff like Frances Ha and Marriage Story, and the big, De Palma-inspired genre film with explosions and car chases that he aspired to make. PTA, on the other hand, has spent his whole career fighting his budgetary restraints and making movies that look like they cost twice as much as they actually did. So, it really feels like he's been working his whole career towards making a movie like this. And with over $130 million at his disposal, he's finally been given the keys to do so. And it's not like he's been this completely underground, micro-budget filmmaker. His movies have all had respectable Hollywood budgets, no matter how much people joke about Maya Rudolph subsidizing her broke husband's career, but $130 million is more than triple his previous highest budget. In my Barbie review, I argued that White Noise flopping was actually sort of unintentionally based, considering the story's anti-consumerist themes and Netflix's practice towards film commodities. But where Baumbach essentially burned $100 million, PTA has turned his $100 million into a Molotov cocktail, an urgent reminder of how fucked everything is right now. One battle after another follows Leonardo DiCaprio's Bob Ferguson and his daughter Willa, who are living under fake identities after Bob's time in an ill-fated revolutionary group, the French 75, up until around the time Willa was born. Willa's mother, Teyana Taylor's Perfidia Beverly Hills, has gone into hiding in Mexico after naming names and effectively causing the French 75's demise at the hands of Sean Penn's Colonel Lockjaw, who after detaining her offered lenience in exchange for sexual favors. Having a convulsive lust for Perfidia, Lockjaw is likely Willa's biological father. I know this is a lot to keep up with so far, but that's just the backstory. 16 years later, Bob is a burnout dad to a begrudging Willa, and Lockjaw becomes a candidate for an uber-elite fraternity of white supremacists called the Christmas Adventurers, which I guess is something like a Moose Lodge, only like a million times more racist. Though in all fairness, I don't know how racist Moose Lodges actually are, so maybe it's not that big an exaggeration. Anyway, trying to keep his physically intense love of black women a secret, Lockjaw sends his patrol out to kidnap Willa and determine if she really is his daughter, aka living proof that he has besmirched his race. Bob, hazy from years of smoking weed and drunk driving, is thus forced to reawaken his revolutionary spirit and get Willa back. Having not read Vineland, from which one battle was notably inspired but not outright adapted, I can't really point to which aspects of this movie's absurdity come from the source material and which come from PTA himself, who's known for his wonky and provocative sense of humor, though Pynchon likely played a formative role in developing that sense of humor. It's my understanding that most of the specific characters and concepts like the Christmas Adventurers come from PTA himself, simply laid over the basic narrative and perhaps tonal foundation of Vineland. To say nothing of PTA's entire directorial body of work, considering the recent confirmations that he worked on the screenplays of both Killers of the Flower Moon, which showcases white supremacy with comedic frankness,
Knights come marching in, that's it, Fitz.
Hey, Ernest.
as well as Ridley Scott's Napoleon, in which Bonaparte is rendered with all the pathetic sexual puppy-doggedness of Lockjaw, I think it's safe to say that this is very much his own brainchild. You have to remember, this is a guy whose primary reaction to Get Out was a fond longing for his pathetic country.
It actually, ironically, made me homesick. Who were you identifying with, Paul?
This follows what has been a bit of a sentimental streak from PTA, whose career people have compartmentalized into a coke phase and a weed phase. The weed phase arguably began with Inherent Vice, which is an intentionally convoluted case whose particulars wash away in service of the romance at the heart of the story. That romance continues into the thorny Phantom Thread and saccharine Licorice Pizza, but the parental angle of One Battle is new ground in this through line. And through the lens of the coke to weed spectrum, I think this is less the chill weed that gave Licorice Pizza its slacker hangout charm, and more so weed paranoia. It's like all the stuff he loves about the San Fernando Valley filtered through this evil, cosmic sludge lens. The worst part being that world is closer to our world than the romantic nostalgia of those other films. And it's frankly refreshing to see this big a release be so unafraid of being perverse and weird and potentially alienating. Sean Penn gives a physical performance as Lockjaw entirely built around contorting his posture and expressions in ways I didn't think humanly possible. He walks like the guy from Quap. But this is all balanced by how straight up entertaining the movie is. While not really an action film, this is the most kinetic and physically stimulating movie PTA has made yet. The opening prologue is essentially an extended 30-minute montage of the French 75's actions, cross-cut with Bob and Lockjaw's respective encounters with Perfidia. After the time skip, we get a little bit of reprieve, but when the plot kicks into high gear, it's pretty much set piece after set piece for the rest of the movie. The music plays no small part in this either, with some of the most front-to-back relentlessness we've gotten from PTA's collaborations with Johnny Greenwood, and even the few needle drops make a big splash. Dirty Work is such a tired song to put in a movie at this point, and I still got chills when it ushers us into the present day. And that there's an equally chilling Mo Bamba needle drop speaks to the registers this film is operating on. On every audio-visual level, PTA is expectedly dialed in. He's just finally able to elevate that prowess to the magnitude he deserves. Shot on VistaVision and premiered in IMAX 70mm, this is a massive movie. A friend I saw this with remarked that, displayed on the Lincoln Square IMAX screen, Sean Penn's erection in the opening scene is likely the size of a human body. There's a car chase that largely consists of hills going up and down from the car's POV, and it's the first time in a long time that motion on screen has elicited a physical reaction in me. The VistaVision also brings such a strong texture to the film. There's so many different types of lights in the dingy spaces Bob journeys through, and PTA and DP Michael Bauman revel in all the different types of halation and white balance changes they can capture. That's maybe a more technical detail not related to the general takeaway of the film, but I think it's worth bringing up because I think there's an integrity to the image here that isn't there in digital movies of similar scale. Every frame of Bob's journey is busied with political chaos. Fire, smoke, tear gas, bodies running. It all feels very tangible, very viscerally threatening, and also just very alive. There's a sequence where Benicio del Toro's sensei Sergio Carlos walks Bob through an apartment building filled with people, in which we traverse storefronts and hallways and apartments, back passageways, all in one take, and it's such a great demonstration of the expansive worlds that exist in the fringes far beyond our casual sight. And a long take is, of course, one of the go-to devices for directors to flex their ability to control chaos, but this one is so well integrated into the sequence that surrounds it, it doesn't feel show-offy or ostentatious in any way, despite how impressive it is. That unassuming impressiveness is true of the film at large and the various things pulled off here, but it's also textually true of the characters themselves. Pretty much across the board, everyone operates with a level of competence that was surprising to me. And this is the case with both of PTA's Pynchon adaptations. From their burnout attitudes, you would think both Doc Sportello and Bob Ferguson would be these Lebowski-esque incompetents in over their heads. So one of the most refreshing things about them is that they both largely know what they're doing, and it's the absurd world around them that makes things difficult for them. And sure, a more significant portion of one battle hinges on Bob's slip-ups, drinking a beer as he drives past a cop, falling 4 stories after failing to clear a jump from one building to the next, missing a sniper shot, and being too high and generally brain-fried to remember a secret code word. But honestly, this last thing is something that I've wanted more spy movies and shows to do. It doesn't feel like incompetence, but rather the average human's ability to remember something verbatim forever, and that humanist logic applies to all the other stuff Bob messes up on. It's not his fault he can't parkour across rooftops with the same theatrical grace and acrobatics that Sensei's skateboarding lackeys have. Similarly, Sensei has a superhuman ability to keep calm under pressure and anticipate what's coming and manage the people around him, and Lockjaw has the imperviousness of Will Ferrell and Austin Powers.
Hello up there! I seem to have fallen down a cliff. I'm very badly burned, so if you could just... You shot me!
This runs the risk of being too unbelievable, but weirdly enough, his competence as a soldier actually tempers his otherworldly affect, in my opinion, and it all balances out. I need one of those Charlie Rose fan edits, but it's Lockjaw and Quaritch having a conversation. And Willa isn't some super child soldier, nor total fish out of water. Having been begrudgingly trained on all this stuff she doesn't understand, she responds to the situation she's dropped into with competence and procedure. And I guess what I'm getting at here is that there is an overwhelming sense throughout the film of everybody's potential to contribute meaningfully to the world around them, whether that capacity is used towards progress or destruction. It's hard to call a $100 million Hollywood film revolutionary in any way, but this really approaches some populist calls to action that you don't really see in Hollywood, no matter how many hit films get branded as the woke left. One of the complaints I've seen from naysayers of this movie have to do with how much they enjoyed the film's prologue following the French 75 more than they enjoyed the present-day plot. Maybe this is a matter of marketing, but the movie this turned out to be was more or less the movie I expected, at least in terms of Bob navigating this absurd American landscape chasing after his daughter. That we get such a rich and extended backstory was more of a pleasant surprise to me, but I understand why people responded to this earlier chapter so much. It seems all of the film's critical and absurd elements coexist in a much tighter vacuum. The French 75 are living in close quarters, lockjaws on their back, it's the height of Bob's relationship with Perfidia, and there's a palpable excitement to the potential that the movement actually has a chance at changing the country in a material way. The spirit of the revolution is alive, so to speak, and people genuinely respond to that. There's naturally something a little more subdued about the present-day stuff by comparison, and I can see how that might be underwhelming from an audience perspective. But I think the landscape we navigate in the present day, where all these elements are scattered and deteriorating, speaks more to the current moment. We're living well into the shadow of liberation groups like the Black Panthers and the Young Lords being neutered by the state in the 60s and 70s. And sure, the Black Panthers still exist, but they have so much less political power than they held at the height of their movement, and that ennui is primarily what one battle captures. This reality, in which revolutionary spirits are forced into complacency, is also why I've seen detractors say that the film is not radical enough. And like I just said, this is a $100 million piece of Hollywood capital. There was no reality in which they let slip something truly radical and inciting. I don't even think it was PTA's intent to make a radical film. There's certainly a reading where, by getting iPhones at the end and attending official protests, Bob and Willa have actually gained closure by becoming less radical and more compliant with the state. But I do think, just by virtue of how the world has changed, the current American landscape has rendered the film more radical than it probably would have been 2 years ago. Something like Sensei's Latino Harriet Tubman operation would still have demonstrated the revolutionary spirit flowing throughout the country's undercurrents, but now it feels like a particularly direct response to the Trump administration. And I don't mean to suggest that we didn't have many of these issues under Biden, or that they are even particularly novel from the first Trump administration, or America's history at large, but the sudden and sheer force that Trump too has escalated these things, and the absurdity of it all, makes this film inherently more radical and tapped into the moment without itself having done anything differently. Because I think, first and foremost, this is just a movie about trying to be a good dad in a volatile world, and it's in rendering this volatile world that the film becomes such a sprawling and salient American satire. Any potential naivete or lack of radical conclusion I can take with a grain of salt because, to some degree, this feels like a story PTA needs to tell himself in order to have any hope that raising kids in the complete nightmare of today is not a lost cause. And that personal angle looms over everything else in the film. Moments like Bob lamenting that he can't do his daughter's hair, the resentment Perfidia feels towards her own baby, and the foreignness of her own body, the realism of this stupid-ass school dance from the perspective of a jaded dad, all feels deeply intimate. This all makes me think of the white noise comparison again, and the value of adapting postmodern literature into mainstream cinema. That's a movie that's also about paternal anxieties against an increasingly absurd and threatening world, but its reach is so much more limited. We rarely feel like we are examining life outside the vacuum of Jack's family. The microcosm of the town never feels like it reaches urgently into our own world. While Baumbach's aesthetic sensibilities held that movie back from leaning entirely into whatever genre it was trying to be and heard it as an engaging and entertaining experience, I think the reason it failed to make any sort of cultural impression is because of how Baumbach failed to adapt it to the times. While it had implicit relevance in its COVID parallels, and while there's so much universality to the book that still speaks to today despite being written in the 80s, adapting it with as much fidelity as Baumbach strived for resulted in something stale and lifeless. All the 80s clutter, which in the book's prose speaks to the extreme consumerism of the 80s, doesn't feel like white noise in the movie. Doesn't feel like capital creeping its way into every crevice of our vision. It just feels like kind of generic period production design. From this foil, we can see why everything about One Battle just feels so much more electric. Of course, it literally takes place in the modern day, but there's also something very modern about the nature of PTA's adaptation process here. Rather than the traditional framework of taking the text in bulk and, trimming the fat for the size and scope of a movie, he applies these original vignettes he wrote himself to the basic framework of Vineland, which I find very innovative. It lends itself to the absurdity of this variety show ensemble act, and it feels like an exchange of ideas, like he's not just lifting and repackaging the text, but responding to it, engaging in a dialogue with Pynchon rather than just amplifying him. And I think there's something to that dialogue that cuts deep into the ethos of this film. The old fixtures are not to be sanctified and left untouched, but rather broken down and used to create something new, expressive of new ideas and new voices. This is something the French 75 advocate for, and it's something that the film itself advocates for. And that's not to give points to a film for having a generally agreeable message about progressive values, but considering where things are at in America and the world right now, it's the kind of simple idealism that rings very loudly and profoundly. This kind of forward thinking and urgency about the now is doubly impressive when you consider how much of PTA's career has been spent in these romanticized older periods, how much all of his sensibilities, down to his analog sticklery, suggests a man stuck in the past. And it's in this regard that Bob becomes an especially credible PTA surrogate. That is, if it wasn't obvious from him sparking up a doobie and watching the Battle of Algiers on TV. Bob is himself a man stuck lamenting the past, using analog machinery. Part of his arc is learning to live a life of agency in the modern world. By the end of the film, he gets an iPhone. He no longer keeps Willa on a tight parental leash. He is once again an active participant in the world around him. And that arc manifests on PTA's part by simply making this very modern film. Because I think he's found the perfect compromise of carrying his older sensibilities into the present day without losing what it is he loves about them. Even though this movie is such a biting tableau of modern America, so much more modern than anything else he's produced to date, PTA still finds a way to avoid the texturelessness of today. One of the implicit things I love about crime movies in general, one of the reasons they're so physically rich and people respond to them on such a visceral level, is that by acting outside the law, the characters of these movies have to engage with more analog devices than your average person. Sleek, modern technology is synonymous with state surveillance, so people who live outside the law have to rely on older, tactile machinery. Themselves primarily people in hiding or in political exile who live on the fringes, the characters of this film can't afford to hold the CIA in their pocket. Instead, they have to rely on 1G service and payphones, using coordinates because they have cars with no GPS or smart system. Whether it's Bob and Willa living under fake identities, the former French 75 members who live in hiding, or the participants of Sensei's operation, in all of these scenarios, analog becomes radical. Of course PTA made this movie. Even Lockjaw, an agent of the state, uses an analog DNA test as he conducts his extrajudicial investigation, and PTA turns the tactile display of the field test kit into a ticking clock in that scene, which works specifically because of how physically daunting the display is. I think this makes One Battle, then, a rewarding foil to Ari Aster's Eddington as well, which I also enjoyed. Both intent on absurdist satire, Eddington leans completely into digital life, filming screens wherever possible. That movie is also far less humanist, and thus skeptical of any form of resistance. If the state allows it to happen, Aster argues, then clearly it is not a legitimate threat to the state's goals. This is a notion that's not necessarily absent in One Battle, but I think the film's analog sensibilities and the warmth of its textures speak to a more empathetic film that, although skeptical and maybe somewhat jaded, is ultimately optimistic about the will of the human spirit to fight back however it can. So this is how PTA spends his money. I hate to bookend this discussion with such an anti-art through line, but it is remarkable right now how much money is spent on movies that have no artistic fingerprint and in no way contribute to the cultural conversation. This movie is both topical and universal. It's so dynamic and fun and beautiful, and so clearly a cohesive, singular vision of the world. PTA is often cited as the exception that proves the rule when it comes to broader discussions about the death of cinema, but it's not hard to see why. In a time where TikTok movie discussions describe even the most mainstream, critically successful movies as esoteric art house bullshit, this sort of outrageous, entertaining audacity is exactly what's needed to prove them wrong. That's it from me this time around, but to account for my lack of uploads on this channel this year, I'll redirect you to some of the other stuff I've been working on. I directed a few music videos for the band Snowmen as they gear up for their album release in November. I've been writing for SLANT magazine, getting some bylines in the written publication world, which is something I'd be happy to talk more about at a later date. And, of course, my Patreon is still active, where you can find hours and hours of bonus content. I apologize for the relative radio silence lately, but let's just say I'm about to be back in a big way. Next video is going to be on After the Hunt, so stay tuned, and if you're watching this from the future, I'll just link to it now. Okay, that's it for real. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.